I was about 13. This was a good 5 years ago. I was at my friend's house, where I don't think I was supposed to be because I have strict parents, and we were hanging out. My friend is 2 years younger than me, but we grew up together, so for the most part everything was normal, until there was a knock at the door. Now, we were at her house alone, and were definitely not expecting anyone. I'm a pretty fearless person for the most part, who has no regard for her own safety, but a strong regard for the safety of others. I walked to the door and peered through the curtains. Past the door, there was a man in his late 30s who was standing with a clipboard. His car wasn't in the driveway, but on the street by the house. I think, no, scratch that. I know he saw me, because he began to speak. "I'm here to fix your cable." My friend on the stairs has had people come to do things like this before, but her parents have always told her when and if it was happening. Her face looked confused and utterly terrified. She isn't the bravest, but I did have a bad feeling about the guy. So by now I think, okay, don't open the door and he will leave. A rational idea, right? Well, at this point, the man kept knocking and knocking. The knocking then turned to banging. He must have been kicking the door too, because the sound was so loud and violent that I thought the door was going to break. She lived on such a busy street that I'm incredibly unsure how none of her neighbors that knew she was home alone at the time heard any of the commotion. Of course, we panicked, but I knew I had to take control of the situation. My friend was in no state to move, let alone take the lead. I was 13 though, so I was out of my mind, horrified. I snuck around to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. I checked the back door and went to my friend who was sat on the stairs, as the stairs are between each door, but have walls that go down each side, so we were out of sight. When I got back to the stairs, the knocking stopped. My heartbeat seemed to have stopped too, because it sounded like the world became empty. The front doorknob began to turn as he tried to open the door, which was followed by more silence. After maybe 15 seconds, I heard something that I was definitely not happy to hear. Now you see, if I were an adult, there was no way this man would say anything like that to me, right? His tone was that of a crazed man, and it left me feeling as if every bone in my body suddenly turned to jello. Either way, we sat very still. A couple of minutes passed and we thought that we were in the clear. That's when I heard gentle pulling, followed by a loud banging on the backyard glass door. At this point I grabbed my friend and bring her upstairs. I grab the phone and we go to her mum's room to get into the closet. I call the police, feeling physically ill, and talk to the lady on the line. She questions us, and my friend had started crying. I answer her questions, and she tells me that someone's coming, and that I have to wait on the line. I feel like puking, but keep incredibly calm to ensure that my friend doesn't fall into a full-blown panic attack. She's known to get worked up easily, and couldn't keep her calm and take care of the situation at the same time. Eventually the banging stops, and I begin to breathe again. "Can you still hear him?" I answer the officer with a no, and she tells me that I should check to see if he's still there. She informs me to be quiet and careful. I slowly climb down the stairs and peek at the back door. No one's out there. I walk to the front and step into the room with a window and basically crawl to it. When I peek my head over, I see the man sitting on the stairs outside on his phone. This just sends me into a frenzy, so I respond in a panic that he is. She tells me to go back and hide, and the police are very close. Eventually, after a long time, there's banging on the door again. This time it ends quickly. A nice lady officer calls to us from outside saying we can come out. We go downstairs and see a male officer talking to the man, while the woman comforts us. Apparently the man works for the cable company, and was informed to go around back if no one was home and let himself in. I think anyone can see the flaw in his alibi, but he had a clipboard and had God knows what on it, and the police checked and let him go. The woman told us she believed us and not him, but there wasn't much else they could do. I'd hate to think what could have happened had the man got in. I chalked it down to a cable guy that's really passionate about his work, but now I have to accept that it's most likely not the case. I hate to think that people like him who clearly have bad intentions get away so easily. Maybe I could understand if we lived in a bad neighborhood, but where we lived had always been so incredibly safe. I have had a number of paranormal experiences. When I was 14, my brother left for college, and I moved into his old room. Some spooky stuff happened there. For the record, it was just me and my parents. We lived in a small town, and my friends all lived in a larger neighboring town, so no one ever came over. Anywho, as my brother left for college, I entered high school. Most of this stuff happened during my freshman year of high school. September. After moving into the room, a skull is drawn on the dust on the window pane, near where my head rests when I sleep. It was a pretty well-drawn skull. It was on the indoor side of the window, so someone had needed to enter my room to do it. It freaks me out, and I wipe it away. Several days later, it's night. I'm studying on my bed. The lights in the room make the windows look like mirrors, as such happens at night. I look up from my textbook towards the skull window, and see a white silhouette standing behind me. Shocked, I hold my gaze for 10 seconds, turn my head around to see it directly, but it's not there. I turn to the window, and it's no longer in the reflection, and I don't sleep there that night. A few weeks pass. It's 11:09 p.m, and I'm waiting for Loveline to come on the radio. My lights are off. I'm facing the same window, and a smaller, white silhouette strides past the window right in front of me, but outside. I leave, and don't sleep there for several nights. After that occurrence, I start seeing more things drawn on the windows, mostly geometric shapes. I vaguely remember a triangle thing which gave me the creeps, but one thing I really remember, I even got a sticky note with "draw below this" on it, and stuck it on a window. Within a few days, I found a light, perfectly drawn circle beneath the note. During all of high school, I was pretty terrified of that entire portion of the house. I would avoid it as much as possible, and I'd occasionally see dark figures out of the corner of my eye, but apparently that's a normal thing for people, so I won't put too much authority into that. Even as a child, I remember seeing colourful orbs buzzing around, though I didn't know what to think about them. But one night, during my junior year of high school, I went over to my washer/dryer, which is directly down the hall from the spooky bedroom. At that point, I'd just chosen to stop sleeping there. I look down the hall, get the normal feeling of dread, and turn my back to the hall, and bend over to empty the washing machine. I instantly lose control of my body, release my basket, stand straight up, and hear a masculine voice exhale and hiss in my ear. I regain control of my body and run the hell out of there. I also have a couple of weird family-relating things, both related to my late great-aunt. In the summer between my sophomore-junior year, my father had been having heart problems, as he had done over the past decade. My brother and I were visiting him at the hospital. My brother will bring him home tomorrow morning, and he's going to have surgery in a month. At some point, the image of my late great-aunt pops into my mind. Something seems very significant about it. Roughly 24 hours later, I'm home with my dad, and tasked with waking him up from his nap. He's blue and cold. He never wakes up. A year or two later, it's Friday night. I'm in the recliner chair where my father passed away. My mother and I are watching TV, and I smell perfume for about a minute. Is it my mother's? No, she says. The smell dies down but picks up a few minutes later. I checked the scented candles on the fireplace, but they aren't lit and didn't smell like anything regarding this perfume. Suddenly I realize it's the same perfume that my late great-aunt wore. 2 nights later, my grandfather refuses to eat, and he dies Thursday 6 days after the phantom perfume. This happened to me just last weekend. After a bucket list road trip with a friend, Eric, to Palm Springs/Mount Jacinto, we were now heading back home to Southern California. I fell asleep on the drive back since we've been up since 6 a.m. and left Palm Springs around 1:30 p.m. so that we could get home before rush hour traffic, and I was really exhausted from hiking. The drive home was just short of 2 hours through the main freeways. Eric decided to stop by an AM/PM gas station around an hour in from our drive, and since I fell asleep, I couldn't remember from which exit we were coming from. But I think we were somewhere near Murrieta and Rainbow. I remember there was a Target or shopping mall near the gas station. As I was getting up, I could hear Eric talking to someone as he was pumping gas. Apparently, a teenaged transient came up to him begging for a ride, saying he got let out by his family and just needed a lift a few blocks down the road. I could not hear clearly the conversation, but as I focused my vision, I could see a homeless kid walk around the car towards the passenger side door to talk to me for permission. I was locking my door when I saw the homeless kid come round the corner. He really wanted to get into the car. I didn't see much of the kid's face, but from what I could tell, he was a white teenaged kid between 17 to 19, with black hair, who wore all black, had a backpack and a cell phone. He strongly smelled of weed and pee. Eric panics. At least, this is how he explained it to me, and told the kid that he would give the kid a lift since it was only a few blocks down. I was already giving Eric silent dagger stares as he got back in the car, and homeless kid got into the back seat behind me. The moment the homeless kid got into the car, his attitude took a turn for the worse. He started talking weird. He tried to sell us drugs or weed and kept asking questions directed to Eric, though enthusiastically about porn or shooting a porn, getting girls and where he can do casting calls. He also told us that our car was trash, as the back seat was filled with camping gear. He asked us where we went, and told him with little specifics that we came back from camping. He then tried to convince Eric about shooting a porn film. After we passed several streets and exits, every time we would ask him where to drop him off, he would mumble and say, "Keep driving," in a low tone, before being all happy and excited again. The homeless kid took notice of Eric's Beat headphones that happened to be around his neck, and made several attempts to trade it for weed. Now, I can tell that homeless kid was sensing that I was not too happy about the situation, and apparently could see my facial expressions of about to cry/scared from the passenger side mirror, to which he asked in a dark and serious tone, "Why are you acting weird?" He became silent from this point, and when asked again as to where we can drop him off, he responded back with, "Keep driving." This happened several times. We asked him as we passed a street or exit. I was no longer having this, and was scanning the highway/freeway for a good escape plan. I was worried this kid was a dealer, as he had a cell phone and probably would be leading us to his cellars, and worse, get jumped. This kid could also easily point a knife around my neck from the back seat and keep us hostage. First thing I did was quietly kicked my purse underneath my seat and kept my hands down where he could not see from the side mirror. I saw a crowded exit where I can tell there was a populated gas station and signaled to Eric to drive there, which, thank God, he did. The homeless kid asked why we were stopping there. I lied and said that we needed to grab something from the gas station. As we pulled up, I noticed there was a crowded diner next to the station and signaled Eric to park there. More people equals more witnesses equals more help if things go south. We told the kid he needs to get off as nicely and as firmly as we could. He got annoyed, but Eric kept distracting him with the prostitution talk, which he would turn all happy about, and even say that he would pay Eric $5,000 if he needed some women. This finally got the kid out. Now the car Aaron drove was an old manual and does not respond fast enough as we were leaving the parking lot. In fact, it stalled for a good 10 to 15 seconds or so before Eric could get it running, which at the time was in the back seat to check if he may have swiped some valuables. Since the car was not fast enough, I can see the kid was not too happy with him being dropped off and was glaring at me. Then he started to contact someone on his phone. This all happened within the span of 10 minutes, which I felt was an eternity, and I seriously thought I would end up in a ditch somewhere. Unfortunately, this triggered very bad memories for me, because back in college I was able to get away from an assault, and all my anxiety from that experience came back 200-fold. Once me and Eric were back on the main freeway, I pretty much released my frustration on him for putting us in possible danger. Anyone who knows my friend Eric knows he's not a huge risk taker, is never trusting of strangers, and is not very social for him to help out hitchhikers, so that's very unlikely for him. Eric explained to me that the homeless kid's personality was different when he first spoke to him at the gas station. He seemed genuinely desperate for a ride home, was about to cry, and even offered money for the lift. This seems to be a lie, as he tried to solicit money from us during the drive. Eric said if he'd have known that the kid would have acted all schizo, he would have never let the kid in the car, but he panicked when he thought he was about to grab/approach me. Eric at least admitted that he messed up big time, but what pissed me off was how he kept telling me that it's done and acted all okay after the incident, but I seriously wanted to kick his butt. Now Eric isn't a very street-smart individual, so I had to tell him a bunch of MOs. Most robberies/assaults of crazy hitchhikers or drug dealers used to lure their victims, stemming from lost kid excuse, missing a ride, and I even pointed out the kid had money and a cell and could have easily called for a taxi or catch a bus. It was most likely the kid was either high or crazy and possibly a runaway, which I hope he was, rather than a drug dealer, luring us to his cellars to get robbed/jumped, and we got lucky. I even scared Eric, saying we were lucky no other cars were following us back home. But it was another hour drive on the busy freeway, and back roads, so even if the crazy kid had accomplices, I hope they gave up. Either way, this experience rattled me badly, and I barely slept that night. When we got home, as if fate was telling us how lucky we were, every commercial or ad we saw on the TV showed either trailers or movies about Split, the guy who took 3 girls in their own car, or ads about the fails of hitchhiking. I made sure to point this out to Eric, who sadly seemed indifferent about what happened. It's been 2 days now, and I've had nightmares about the incident and have been jumpy. For now, time will tell when I will be fine again. I do have another road trip coming up with Eric, and hopefully more friends, but I plan to buy some pepper spray for the trip just in case. I also told Eric that I will call the shots on where to get gas and brush up on street-smart safety procedures. Hopefully, this is a lesson for Eric, to not pick up crazy hitchhikers. In the summer of 1995, I was 11. Sleeping late, home alone at around 10 to 11 a.m., while my parents were at work. I got woken up by the doorbell, so instinctively, I hurried up down the corridor. But before I rushed to open the door as I normally would, I remembered the many times my mum scolded me for opening the door without asking, "Who is it?" first, or at least looking through the peephole to make sure that it was safe to open, especially after having some previous creepy experiences that have already taken place at this point. I ask, "Who is it?" But all I heard was some unintelligible mumble, so I brought a chair and stepped on it in order to look through the hole. We lived in an apartment building, and on the right of our door was the elevator, and then the staircase. Since the staircase windows were on the far left corner, there was not enough natural light to help me see who it was. I just saw a male with some colourful t-shirts standing outside. I repeated the question, and then strained to hear the answer. He said he was looking for Miss Spencer. That's my mother's maiden name, and I said she was at work. To give you some context, both of my parents are doctors, and I don't know if that sounds weird for the US or the rest of the Western world, but in Eastern Europe in the 90s, it wasn't uncommon for grateful patients to sometimes stop by, wanting to give thanks by bringing fresh fruit and vegetables from their garden, especially those which my parents had helped, but they couldn't pay. So the man said he was bringing something for my mum, except even in the murky light, I could see that his hands were empty. I asked where it was, and he said he left the package at the stairs. At this point, I'm starting to feel uneasy, that something isn't right. So I had to be cautious and lie and tell him I didn't have keys. I said my parents were at work and they told me to not open the door to strangers, so when they come back they can help him. He starts to get agitated and said he couldn't wait that long, and then says that he is actually bringing meat, so it would get spoiled in the heat if it's left outside. I start to hesitate because I'm thinking, well, what if he's telling the truth? Will I get in trouble for letting the meat spoil? But then I look through the spy hole again and see his hair, which means he has his ear pressed to the door listening in. That spooked me, and I said to him, "Sorry, I can't help you. Please go away and come back later when I'm not alone." He once again says that he does not have the time to come back, and he offers to leave and says he will leave the package at the stairs. So when he is gone, I will not be afraid to open the door and retrieve it myself. I keep quiet and intently observe him as he goes down the stairs and makes the noise of climbing down, and then I freeze, because in the silence that ensued, I was just about to really open the door and check, when I saw part of his t-shirt sleeve behind the corner of the stairs. He was hiding there, probably hoping I would open the door thinking he was gone, when in fact, he was preparing to do gosh knows what. Pounce on me? Break into the apartment? I got so scared, I froze and just kept on watching, standing on the chair behind the door. And finally, after what seemed like hours, but was probably no more than 10 minutes, I heard him really descend down the stairs. I didn't open the door. I called my mum's hospital, but she couldn't be put through. So I waited for them to come back home in the afternoon. They both got worried, but proud that this time I finally did the right thing. A few hours later, all the kids from the building and I were at the little square/playground area in front of it. It was buzzing with kids running around, so it was completely safe, and my best friend Nina and I were sitting on one of the benches, when suddenly a strange man approaches us and stands next to one of the benches. He says, "Are you Jemima?" I hesitantly confirm, although my heart starts to beat faster. as I recognized the voice. It was the same man from the morning. This time I'm not alone, so I instinctively press myself closer to Nina when he says, "Well, I'm bringing something for your father, Matthew, but it's in the car, and I've parked it on the street. Come with me to help me bring it." Encouraged by my friend's presence and all the people around, I say to him that actually my dad is home, so if he waits there I'll go get him, and he could help him bring whatever he needs from the car, as I am little and can't carry anything heavy. The moment I said it, the guy quickly got quiet and walked away. Not running, just walking very briskly. My friend already knew what happened this morning, and I ran to my apartment, told my dad, and he ran in his shorts to chase after the guy. But of course there was no trace of him. My dad started asking away then, as once again something typical for Eastern European countries. Their grandma sitting on the balconies and benches looking at everyone and everything going on, like a live security system. Nobody had noticed anything except one grandma, an old lady living alone on the first floor, who says that a guy approached her earlier while she was sitting on her balcony and started asking her about our family, then tried to ask her for money to pay for the meat he was bringing, as he told her that my parents had purchased it from him. She told him that she had no money, but stupidly gave him a lot of information like my name. We never heard anything about the guy, but thank God. Those questions are still puzzling me. What did he want? Why did he say my mum's name, but then said that he was bringing something for my dad? Was he actually focused on me? I hope that I never have to find out. I also remember that when school started after that summer, there was another situation that seemed weird and possibly dangerous. I was coming back from school and I saw my friends gathered in front of the apartment building, but in the entrance furthest away from the one I lived in. I was talking to them when I heard my mum calling me. I turned and saw she was heading to work, going towards the bus stop, but she called me to go to her, and when I did, she told me that she wants me to immediately go back home. I grumbled but obliged, so from my point of view what happened was this. I reach our entrance of the building and open the door when I feel someone coming close behind me, but I don't turn and think nothing of it. Then I start climbing the stairs quickly, because I was afraid to take the elevator alone. But I heard that there were equally quick footsteps following me up the stairs, and just when I was fiddling for my keys about to unlock the door, I heard my mum's extremely worried voice shouting my name from downstairs, which startled me. But then the footsteps stopped right before the person reached my floor, and they started descending back. Then my mum climbs to our floor, hugs me, and we lock the door and she tells me what actually happened. She was going to work, but sees me talking to my friends. She then looks around and sees a creepy-looking man standing nearby staring at us, while we are all oblivious to his presence. So she calls my name and tells me to go home. She turns and starts for the bus stop, but then an impending sense of dread consumes her and she looks back, seeing that the guy is no longer where he was but actually now following me. And the moment she turns, she actually sees how I enter the building and he disappears a few seconds behind me. My mum starts running in sheer panic, then reaches the entrance and shouts my name, and then she hears his footsteps back down, and when she reaches the ground floor he passes her, but my mum said he gave her such an evil menacing glare, as if he wanted to strangle her for preventing his intentions or something. She said alarm bells rang in her head and her whole body was full of adrenaline, ready to fight if she must, because she felt I was in real danger. To give a little bit of background, I was a 20-year-old female when this happened. The setting, a motorway in the southwest/West Midlands of England, the year 1990. So I was what was known at the time as a crusty, though I read that they're called gutter punks in the US. I had dreadlocks, listened to anarcho-punk, and dressed in rags. I was a softie from the countryside by birth, but a couple of years into the violent Nottingham squatter scene had hardened me up no end. I had left the squatters and joined the New Age Travellers, and we were an aggressive bunch of heavy-drinking thieves, as you'd be likely to meet anywhere in the UK at the time. For this reason, I was fearless, but youth and a safe upbringing made me stupid when I thought I was streetwise. As was my habit, I'd taken off on my own and gone back to my hometown. Now I was hitchhiking the breadth of the country to get back to the site where my friends were. I remember waiting for my next lift at a service station when this battered old three-wheeled van pulled up. It was filthy and didn't look very pleasant, but it was going in my direction, so I was pleased. The driver seemed okay. A bit serious and intense, I suppose, but he said he could take me to the other side of Birmingham, which was very convenient for me. He was distinctive looking. This was the start of the 90s, and he looked like my dad did during the 70s, and my dad was old-fashioned his whole life. This man had thick black hair and a bit of a quiff and sideburns. He was also V-tanned, like he worked outdoors a lot. He was lean with dark eyebrows, and I remember him so well because he looked like my dad, and my uncle also. Maybe this is why I didn't feel less at ease with him. So we start along the motorway, and it all seemed fine. I was probably chatting like an idiot as usual, and I remember glancing at the back of the van and seeing a heap of junk in there. Bulky and dirty, and some of it covered in a black cloth. He saw me looking at it and said it was equipment for a puppet show, which I found bizarre and incongruous. He didn't look like a children's entertainer. He was more of a child catcher than a friendly clown. Along the road a bit, he started asking me how often I hitch, and I let him know it's routine for me. He says, "But you don't get scared?" "No, not really." But this guy wouldn't leave it. "You must get scared." "No, I really don't." "Why don't you get scared?" "I can handle myself." And so he goes on and on and on. He insists I must be scared and asks me if I'm scared now and how I know I would be able to handle being attacked, and I'm getting really irritated. A bit freaked out as well, because it seems like he wants me to be scared and I'm giving the wrong answer, but mostly annoyed because this conversation is going in circles. Eventually, when he asks why, I reply, "I don't get scared because I carry a knife." This was true, but only a little lock knife for day-to-day purposes. Well, that stopped the line of questions. In fact, it stopped the whole lift. The guy swerved onto the hard shoulder at the side of the road and said, "I'll have to drop you off here." Oh. I was surprised a bit, and pissed off to be left here, but I got out and grumbled to myself as he drove away. Cars aren't allowed to stop on the hard shoulder, and people certainly aren't allowed to walk along it. But what could I do? I stuck my thumb out and started to walk. About 15 minutes later, a police car pulled up and told me off for being there, but kindly gave me a lift across to the far side of Birmingham to a safe and legal hitchhiking spot, where I was picked up by a minibus full of pagan students who took me right to their community/traveller site. Years went by. I left the sites and the squatters, had a baby, got a job, and the only time I thought about this guy was while exchanging hitchhiking stories with people. This was my second favourite story, behind the one about the Christian who drove at around 100 miles an hour on the wrong side of the road because, and I quote, "God will save me." While I screamed back, "I'm an atheist, he won't save me." After I would tell that story, I'd mention the mad puppeteer and his annoying questions. It wasn't until a couple of years ago that I realised the possible danger I had been in. I was watching a show called Crime Watch on the BBC, where they appeal for information, and they had a special on the serial killer Peter Tobin, trying to track his movements through the years. I follow serial killer stories with interest, so I'd heard of him and had seen his picture as an old man. Then they showed the picture of him through the years, and holy shit, there he was, the mad puppeteer. The picture matched, the time matched, just how he looked in the late 80s/early 90s, just how he looked when he ended the life of hitchhiker Dina McKinnell in 1991. I work for the criminal justice system, so I have level-headed colleagues mostly, and told people at work. They agreed I should call the Crime Watch number. It was nothing I could do, no harm. If it was nothing I could do, then no harm. But if it was something, then I could help. I rang the Crime Watch number and said, "It's probably nothing, but..." And a few days later, they rang back and arranged to take a statement. A police officer came by to my house and wrote down everything. A few days later, a second officer came back to my workplace to get more info and to photocopy a diary I kept back then. Frustratingly, I said nothing about this lift in the diary. That's how little I thought I was in danger. The Crime Watch website updated to mention the three-wheeled van, and now is reported in some biographies as fact. People ask me now if I truly believe that was Peter Tobin who gave me the lift. I can never be sure, but in my mind I'm 75% sure I survived a serial killer. At the very least, I now realize how stupid and naive I was feeling, so tough and so fearless. Sometimes when I think of what could have happened, I just feel sick and cold. Because of my job, I realize how many terrible, terrible people there are out there, and I'm just relieved it wasn't my parents searching for answers about one of his victims. So this happened to me on Thursday, April 25th, and I still can't shake off how terrifying and strange it was. So I was home alone getting ready for my midday college class that morning, and I opened my blinds to let some natural light in. I glanced out my window to see a man in his mid-30s wearing a baseball cap, roaming around my property, with his hands on his hips, walking around with a lot of weird confidence. But our yard is kind of like a cliff, and it looks over onto our 5 acres of property down below. I live in the Pacific Northwest, so it's a pretty scenic view. I was really confused and thought maybe it was a worker that my mum had hired for our renovations on the house who was admiring the view. I'm a little bit uncomfortable at this point, because the dude walks to the side of my house out of sight. I head upstairs to see him now roaming around my front yard and my driveway, looking at things, checking out my house, and he still hasn't seen me at this point. I call my dad and ask him if we have hired anyone to come by the house, and he says not that he knows of, and tells me he's going to call my mum and ask her, and then call me back. I'm waiting for the call when I notice this strange dude's car. It's a white Honda with no license plates, just parked parallel to my front door. The dude still hasn't seen me, and he's still wandering around, so I take this as an opportunity to remember that we have a security system and I armed it, so if he did try to break in, it would immediately alert the police. If this was some sort of professional or worker, he would have rung my doorbell or knocked at least once. He did neither. Just then I get a call back from my dad, saying neither him or my mum hired anyone to come by today, and that I need to call our local police station immediately. I went back downstairs after making sure to lock every door and window upstairs, and called my city's police station. I explained to a woman on the other end what is happening, and she decides that she's not going to send an officer out, and instead gives me a number to call their emergency dispatch line and told me to talk to them. I call the number she gives me, and immediately I get an automated message saying, "Thank you for calling the non-emergency hotline. Nobody is available today to take your call. If this is an emergency, please hang up and dial 911. At this point, I'm really irritated, because 15 minutes had passed, and this weird dude is still lurking around my house while I'm home alone, and apparently that wasn't enough to warrant an emergency to the lady I called. I hung up and decided to call 911. After getting in touch with the 911 operator, I was asked a series of questions about his appearance before they would even alert officers near me to start heading towards my house. The whole thing really seemed weird. Nobody was in a hurry to have officers come up to my place when I was a young girl home alone with a strange dude. I asked the officer if I should stay on the line with her when she finally, after what seemed like forever, alerted the police to come to where I was, and she agreed, and I went back upstairs to check on the weird guy. And he's now sitting in his unplated Honda, either listening to the radio show extremely loud or on a phone call with someone through his car. It was a very prominent loud male voice coming from his car. Then all of a sudden, I heard the tone you hear when someone hangs up on you, and the operator was no longer on the line. I was really confused when my thoughts were interrupted by an unrecognized phone number calling me. I assumed it was the operator calling me back, so I picked up. Instead, I was greeted by really creepy heavy breathing. I'm not sure who, but it really freaked me out. I hung up immediately, dialed back 911. I had been pretty calm up until this point, but that phone call put me in panic mode. I got on the phone with another operator who already knew my situation and address before I could even explain it. She said the cops were on their way. 20 minutes had passed at this point. The dude is still here in his car and the cops are not. Keep in mind I live in a smaller town, so there's no reason why it took the cops as long as it did. Finally, this dude is leaving my driveway right as the cops pull up. They ask him a few questions. The cop then comes to my door and hands me a sketchy-looking flyer saying it was just a landscaper. He said he had an appointment. I was really relieved and irritated that it was just a dude my mum had hired. I called my mum back and said the cop said it was just a landscaper that you hired and that he had an appointment. She goes, "I can assure you, we never hired a landscaper. We don't even need one. So creepy dude, who was posing to try and rob our house, let's not meet again." So this is a story that happened to me a few years ago. To give you some context, I am from a country in South America, where there is a lot of danger on the streets. Therefore, all my life I have been aware of people getting close to me, and never trusted strangers at all. A few years ago, I went for my first time on a solo trip, and I chose Europe as a destination. After going around countries and meeting a lot of people, I felt a great sensation of safety. I let my guard down a bit when I was traveling through Germany. I made a stop in a small town that I had heard was really pretty. I stayed the first night in the only hostel there that turned out to be awful since the beginning. It was hard to find, and it ended up being on top of a sex shop. The whole structure looked to be from an office. There was no lock on the rooms at all, and all the people staying there turned out to be old and creepy. Nothing compared to the youthful environment from the other hostels throughout my trip. On top of that, the price for one night on a share room was quite expensive. I slept there for one night, and my plan was to leave on a train the next day to head to another city. The next morning when I woke up, I went to buy my train ticket, and it turned out there were no trains until the next day. So I searched for buses, and the last bus that day had left earlier in the morning. I was trapped there for another night, and I did not feel like paying for another night in that crappy hostel. So my plan was the following. I bought the train ticket next morning just at 6 a.m, and I was thinking of going to some pub or even a nightclub and spend some time there until they would close, and then just wait at the train station to go. I walked around the city, but I couldn't find a nice place to stay until late, so I just came back to the train station without any plan. I saw a Turkish shop of kebabs, and I asked what time they closed. Midnight. And the main guy told me my problem, and I told the main guy my problem, and if it were possible for me to stay there until that time without buying anything. He agreed, and even told me that he would close around 2, so I wouldn't have to be on the street for long. I stayed there, and I was just on my phone waiting for the time to pass, when I had an idea of going to couch surfing to see if someone could offer me a roof to sleep under for the night. I wrote to a lot of people, and only one guy replied to me quickly. It was a guy around my age that was doing his studies in the university of the town. He told me that he was living in the campus, and that I was welcome to come there, as there was a big party going on the main building. He gave me the address and the instructions on which bus to take from where I was. It was around 11 at this time, so I thought, well, this is perfect. I can just be in the party and then come back for my train. I searched how to get there with the next bus, but found out that the campus was in the outskirts of the city, and the bus would take 50 minutes to get there. Furthermore, the next bus would be around 1 a.m, so I'd arrive around 1:50, and then I'd have no time on the way back to catch my train at 6. So I didn't know what to do. I was either waiting and going by bus there, or staying in the party for 2 hours and then coming back and being on the streets from 2 to 6. While I was thinking what to do, I was making small talk with the owner of the shop, and he was super kind and friendly. He was giving me a lot of ideas, like you could go to this bar, there's this hotel, or giving me other bus ideas to get there. Finally, I just decided to stay there a bit disappointed. I just sat and went back to my phone. Then, a few minutes later, 2 of these Turkish guys arrived at the store and were friends with the owner that I was previously talking with, and they picked up some things from the back of the store. Then the owner came to me and said, "Oh, there's an option. My friend, he lives near the campus and is heading there now. I could ask him if he could drop you off on the way to his home." I nodded and asked if it was okay. The guy told me it would be fine, and that he could drop me off, and I just thought, he's the friend of the owner, who's been nice this whole time, and besides, this is Germany. There's nothing to worry about. I was riding shotgun, and in the beginning of the ride it was just small talk. Besides, this guy did not speak English at all, just German. So the whole time I was holding the conversation on my not perfect German that I had studied for a year before. I could understand most of what he was saying, but I couldn't speak that much. I found the way to express myself. First, we were just making small talk on things about the city, but then at some point everything turned out weird. I thought that by car, the time that it would have taken to get there would have been shorter than the bus, so I was expecting a 20-minute ride. But he was just driving around and then asked me, "Are you hungry?" "No," I replied, and he pulled over at Burger King and ordered some food. He started to eat while he was driving, and then just asked me more personal questions, and he started to make me feel awkward like, "Do you have a boyfriend? Have you ever thought about getting married? Would you like to come to this city? I could make the papers for you." I was just answering politely and in a cold way to all of the things and thinking of what to do. I was, who knows where, and it was quite late. He then just started to tell me that he got married with a German woman just for the papers, and then split up with her. Then he was just saying how pretty I was, and that I should totally marry him. I freaked out and was just focused on my thoughts, and I did not notice the outside. Suddenly the car stopped, and I found myself in the middle of an empty field far away from the city. No people around, no lights and no cars. He just stopped the car there. He insisted again on I marrying him. I said no in a stern way and got out of the car. I panicked inside, but I was still holding it. He walked around the car and came to my door. He opened it and told me, "Get out, I want to smoke." I said no again, and he just said even stronger, "Get out." In that moment I thought, I'm done. He's going to do something to me. Who knows what. Then I just thought, okay, let's get out and let's just try to still be polite and not make him angry. I went outside and he immediately came in front of me and just said again, "Why don't you want to marry me? Are you sure you don't have a boyfriend?" And I just said that I was just not very interested and was focusing on my studies. But then I could see he was becoming every time more and more aggressive, until the point where he grabbed my arm very forcefully, and in that moment I just panicked and gave him an anxious look, and he immediately let me go. He went straight into the car, and I thought he would have left me there, but then he yelled to get inside. I jumped in, and the ride was quite quiet. He kept looking in the front. I had no idea where he was going, and I was truly scared. Then he suddenly stopped on some street and told me coldly, "Get out." I got out of the car, and to my surprise I was in front of the campus I was supposed to go. He immediately drove away, and I headed to the party without any clue of what was happening there. I just focused on the party and took the train in the morning. When I arrived at the new city, I just processed everything again and thought to myself, Turkish guy, let's not meet. "5 years ago, I was a little Mormon missionary serving in Nebraska. My companion and I were at church one Sunday, and it was a typical Sunday. Said hi to all the families we saw in the halls and foyer, and there was one 13-year-old girl in the ward named Mary. She was one who always had some sort of snack made up for each of us that week that she gave to us at church. Normally she was always so nice and polite, and always took any opportunity to greet us. She was walking towards us in the hall that morning, and I noticed that she was super pale and had this wide-eyed look, and was just staring straight ahead without blinking. As we were walking by, I said, "Hey Mary, how are you today?" I got no response. She didn't even look at us. Red flags went up, because she would never do something like that. After church, I told my companion that I wanted to talk to Mary's mum to see if everything was okay. When I found her, I could tell that she was uneasy and just looked worried. I asked her, and she immediately began crying. We told her that we would stop by their house immediately after church and see if we could talk with Mary and her family. When we got to her house, I had a kind of eerie feeling. I asked my companion if he felt the same, and he agreed. Mary's mum answered the door and sat us down in the living room. We asked her if everything was all right with Mary. She was at a loss for words for a moment, and just told us that she didn't know. She said the past week Mary acted mad and disgusted towards her family. Mind you, this is one of the closest families I've ever seen. She said that Mary randomly attacked her older brother earlier in the week. Nothing too serious, she just started punching and kicking him. Her mum couldn't understand the sudden change in her attitude. We asked if we could talk to Mary to see if we could get anything out of her. From the couch we were sitting on, we could see down the hallway where the bedrooms were. As soon as I saw Mary come out of her room, and as she started walking down the hallway, I immediately had a feeling that I can't quite fully describe. It was the worst feeling I've ever felt. I can honestly say that the one word to describe it would be evil. Mary had the same wide-eyed look that she had at church. She sat down in a chair in front of us and just stared at the wall in front of her. I asked her if everything was all right. She didn't answer. I asked her if she was angry at her family and why she had attacked her brothers. She finally stopped staring at the wall and looked at me. That awful feeling I had got worse when she looked at me, and she said that she was told to hurt him. I asked her, who told her? And she said the voices told her to hurt her family and leave. I asked her if she knew where the voices were coming from, and she didn't answer. I asked her mother if I could give her a blessing. She immediately said yes. When we gave her a blessing, she didn't resist at all. She just sat there. After we gave her the blessing, the mood immediately changed. She was no longer wide-eyed, with a glazed look about her. Her color was starting to come back, and she was breathing heavily. That awful evil feeling that I had gone away. As male missionaries, we aren't allowed to hug females, but after a few minutes had gone by, Mary gave me a very big hug, and I wasn't about to fight it or deny it. When we left their house and got into our car, my companion and I just both sat there for a few minutes, thinking about what the hell had just happened. He finally broke the silence and said, "I don't like the feeling I had back there." I told him I had the same feeling. We checked up on her next Sunday at church, and she was back to being the happy-go-lucky Mary that everyone knew. We asked her mum how everything was back at home, and she said it was like nothing had happened. A few weeks later, I asked Mary if she remembered anything about it. She said that she could only vaguely remember attacking her brother and not knowing why, and that after that we gave her a blessing. It was like she'd woken up from a dream. Being a religious person, you hear stories about demons and possessions in the scriptures and in stories, and there are countless movies about them. But I never gave it a real second thought. I don't know exactly what happened with Mary, whether she was actually possessed or it be something else. She didn't crawl up a wall. Her head didn't spin around, and she didn't speak in a different language. All I have to go on is this feeling. The feeling I had when she walked into the room, with her glazed look, pale skin, and her answer about the voices. I will never forget that story, or the feeling I had. I hope to never feel it again, and it scared the hell out of me. Sorry to get all religious. One evening, when I was 15 years old, I was at home, alone. My brother was at a football game, and my mum and dad had just left to eat dinner out. I decided I wasn't hungry enough to warrant going out with them, and settled for them just bringing me home takeout. My parents hadn't been gone longer than 10 minutes. I was sitting in the living room on my laptop, when suddenly, I heard the sound of a car door slam. I glanced at the clock in surprise, because I knew there was no way my parents were back this early, unless they forgot something and turned around. So I sat my laptop down and got up to go investigate. I gently pulled one singular blind down to peep out of the bay window in the kitchen that overlooks our driveway. It's twilight outside, so it's nearly dark, but still enough natural light hanging in the sky from the sun that I could make out a 4-door car, not my parents' car, parked alongside the flower bed at the top of our long driveway. It has shrubs and trees that you could park on the other side of and have trouble noticing a car behind them. As my eyes rested on the car, I saw 3 men. I'm assuming they were all men, because of their stature and size, wearing all black, and masks concealing their faces. all exit the car together and start advancing towards the house. One branches off to cover the front yard and thus the front door. The second branching off to go behind the house, which leads to the back door that leads into our garage, which leads into our house. The third guy, however, was cutting across the yard heading to the side door, the one which I was currently standing next to. I snapped my head back and let the blind fall back into place, my heart doing a flip. I took a split second to process where I planned to hole up inside the house, so I would have the best chance of escaping. I chose my parents' bedroom because it's on the main floor right off the kitchen, and right past the back corridor that leads to the garage. I knew it was also a risky place, as it had 2 doors right outside their bedroom, that 2 of the 3 seen villains were currently heading to. But I wanted to hear and know where my opponents were the moment they entered the house. I nearly ripped their bedroom door off its hinges when I grabbed it and slammed it shut to lock it. I leapt across their bed and grabbed the phone and frantically started calling my parents. I called them first, because I'd figured they'd be right down the road and would turn around and make it to the house in time to scare these creeps, but they didn't answer. I dialed my cousin who lives up the road 2 houses away, again because of the same reasoning of him being here so quickly. During all of this, my frantic, panicked mind didn't even think to dial 911. I finally got my cousin to answer as I started to hear bangs at the door outside the bedroom. I knew before my cousin suggested that I needed to arm myself in case they broke into the house before he got there. I threw the phone down and took a deep breath before I slung the bathroom door open, knowing I was going to have to muster the courage to make a mad dash across the kitchen and grab the biggest butcher knife we owned, passing the doors on the way. As I passed by the narrow corridor that leads to the door connecting the garage and the house, I couldn't help but glance over to the door which had a window. There, I saw a man who chose to break off towards the back of the house. He had broken into the garage via the side door that leads from the outside to the inside of our garage. He was in my garage and staring at me just a few feet away, with only a flimsy pane of glass between us. My heart felt like it cut off. I had never had such a narrowing sense of dread in my life. I quickly whipped my head back towards the kitchen and bolted to the other side of it, throwing myself into the drawer and tearing through it to grab a knife. As I raced back towards my parents' bedroom, I could hear the man at the side door banging on it, and I could hear a guy banging at the front door, but no noise from the guy at the garage door. In that moment, I didn't care about anything but barricading myself in my parents' bedroom until I heard my cousin's truck. To this day, I'll never know what happened, but by the time my cousin got there, not 2 minutes after I initially called him, those guys were gone without a single trace. I didn't hear their car door slam as I did before. I didn't hear an engine crank. Nothing. But when I heard the familiar sound of my cousin's truck rush into my driveway, I mustered the courage to peek out of my parents' bedroom. I noticed none of the doors were open or had been forced open. When I realized I could come out, I went outside and found nothing. Cops had been called during this time. I'm assuming my cousin called them after hanging up with me, and I remember vaguely standing there frantically shaking with a butcher's knife still in hand. The cops, I could tell, were confused and possibly didn't even believe my story. In that moment, I even started to question it. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The terrifying knowledge that someone was after our house. The paralyzing fear of knowing that you are about to experience hand-to-hand combat with a criminal. The heart dropping, adrenaline surging rush. All of it. It was real. Those men were there, and for whatever reason I will never know or understand. After the guy in the garage saw me, they decided to book it out of there. Maybe they didn't realize I hadn't left with my parents and had been scoping the place and thought we'd left. Maybe they didn't want to commit to the crime with someone home because they thought it would make too much extra trouble. Maybe they were fathers and couldn't stand the thought of harming a child. To this day, the reason as to why they chose to leave me peacefully are what haunts me just as much as the event itself. Either way, to the 3 men who bum-rushed my house when I was 15, let's not meet again. This happened to me in September of last year. I was driving to my hometown from my current residence, which is about 180 miles away. I had gotten a late start, so the sun was setting when I left, and it was fully dark when I exited the interstate. I turned onto the highway that connected my hometown to the interstate. My hometown is a fairly small city, and the highway runs through a very rural part of my rural state. In the daytime, there's usually a few cars driving around, because there's access to some nice boating areas off the highway. But at that time of night, and this time of year, the highway was basically deserted. Anyway, I noticed someone with a large pack sticking out their thumb. Being September, it was cold enough to make me feel sympathetic for someone stuck walking outside. I'd stopped for hitchhikers a few times before, and never had any real problems. Even been able to help some people who were clearly in a very bad spot in their lives. I remember feeling relieved when I stopped the car and got out, because I saw that the hitchhiker was an older lady. I'm a big guy, but I'm still nervous about being overpowered in situations like that, and I figured that this lady would be a pretty safe ride to give. She looked like she was in her late 40s or early 50s, kind of a rounded face that was weathered and dirty, but not visibly messed up by drug use or anything like that. I helped her put her bag in the back of the car, and she thanked me profusely. The first thing I noticed is that her breath stank of alcohol. It didn't smell like beer, but some kind of liquor, strong enough to make me feel a little woozy when she was talking to me. It didn't really bother me that much though. She seemed fairly lucid, and I didn't think it was my place to judge a transient person for wanting to drink. I probably would in that situation too, but I remember it. I started driving down the road, and we were talking. She seemed pretty pleasant. The fact that she wanted to make conversation eased my mind even more. She mentioned that she had been married before, but had separated from her husband several years ago. She spoke about traveling from the eastern US to the western states several times, and didn't seem too troubled by not having a permanent residence. At that point, I was happy to take her as far as I could, which was about another hour of drive time. Then she started talking about strange things. The first thing she mentioned was that she had left her husband to follow God. This didn't faze me much, because this was in the Bible Belt, and saying that you follow God, or some such, isn't too unusual. But, as she kept talking about it, I realized that she had left her husband to follow the voice of God. Again, mental illness isn't very unusual in this kind of population, and is not something to stigmatize, so I tried not to let it bother me. But again, I was driving with this stranger on a deserted highway on a pitch-black night, and she was starting to talk about God speaking directly to her. She started talking about her travels out west, which was where things got really strange. She described meeting an Arab man with olive skin on the side of a road. He wore a turban, had a beard, and held the leash of a white tiger. They looked at each other. Neither said anything. so she pretended to be a rock and crouched down on the ground until he passed her. I was trying to politely make conversation, so I laughed and asked her, "Really?" in a prompting sort of way. She nodded and began to pick up steam. Her voice raised, and she started talking about hearing gunshots on the plains the day after her encounter with the man and his tiger. She looked up and saw 7 wild horses race in front of her. By this time, I was getting a little nervous. Then she looked at me and said, "Last week, I saw a T-Rex." A T-Rex? I'm pretty sure I wasn't completely hiding the incredulity from my voice. "Yes," she said. "Mother and child." She said that she had seen a gang of men seize the child from the mother and drive metal tie-down stakes into its hands and feet. This is because its eyes weren't open yet, and I presume it would be easier to control that way. They were then pulling ropes through the tie-downs to hold it in place. I'm not sure whether it was the nightmarish scene she was describing or her obviously debilitated mental state, but I decided right then to find a way to part with this woman. I spotted an intersection that led to a smaller east-west highway rather than the southbound one we were on right then, and I told her truthfully that she could come get to where she wanted to go more easily by taking that highway instead of the one we were on, but that I couldn't go that way. I suggested dropping her off at a nearby gas station, and she agreed, much to my relief. I stopped and felt reassured by the lights of the gas station and the presence of a clerk inside. She got out of my car and removed her pack from it. She returned to the passenger side window and looked inside, thanking me for the ride. I responded appropriately, and then she said the strangest thing of all to me. "You remind me of my ex-husband, so I want to give you a piece of advice. Go around Missouri, not through it." She left, and I drove away. I'm determined to not do 2 things: ever meet this woman again, or go through Missouri. In 2014, I was home alone. My then boyfriend, now husband, was at work, as I happened to have a very rare day off. I was watching The Golden Girls as I snuggled our 2 cats and relaxed. I remember feeling a strange, dreadful feeling. I sat up from the couch and noticed a man with shaggy and greasy long hair. He seemed to make eye contact, even though he was roughly 2 blocks away. Then he suddenly broke out in a sprint. I felt this moment in every inch of my body. I rushed into the front porch and locked the screen door before rushing back into the house and locking the main door leading into the house. He was suddenly at the side of our house, punching and kicking the side window of our home as he screamed inaudible screams. Either that, or he was opening his mouth and not making sounds. I don't know which is more terrifying. I was shocked as I stared at him. Suddenly, he lunged off to the side and I realized that the side door might have also been unlocked. I ran to our side door and caught it right as I saw his face appear in the tiny door window. I began to cry and locked it before running into our spare bedroom, whipped out my cell phone and dialed 911 as I cried and tried to explain the issue. For some reason, the story in my memory skips to my upstairs neighbor calling me about 5 minutes later, asking if I'm okay, and me saying, "Do you think I'm okay?" He begins telling me what happened after I hid. Apparently the man had run up to his apartment and knocked calmly, so he answered. He had no way of knowing that the person at his door was not of sound mind, and I had not thought to warn him. He opened the door, leaving only a thin screen between him and this man. He asked the man if everything was okay, to which the man began screaming, "They're trying to kill me. Help." He was shocked and backed up, saying, "Please step back, I will call the police." By then, he was downstairs, dialing already. The man punched his door and ran downstairs, kicking and punching his car in the driveway as he screamed about being chased and on the verge of being murdered. He pulled at the car doors and punched at the windows as he screamed, and I begged for the police to arrive faster. The police showed up as the man was still fighting with the neighbor's car. They had brought along an ambulance and took the man away, strapped him in a stretcher in the back, and we never looked back. I'm going to start by saying that my dad is a character. All of my friends loved him growing up because he could entertain you just by talking to him. This attitude is what initially led me to question the legitimacy of this story for a long time. Now that I'm a bit older, I could tell this one cuts deep every time we make him tell it. Usually, he talks in a very upbeat and active tone, but when my brothers and I first heard him tell this story, or talk about it in general, his tone completely changes. It feels as if the color just rushes from his face. It's obvious he doesn't enjoy talking about it. He was about 18 at the time. From pictures, he seemed like an athletic, approachable teen. He was living in the Gary/Whitting area of northwest Indiana. Sometime later in the evening, my dad, who's been a smoker for roughly 50 years of his life, decides to hitchhike to his local convenience store. He has a knack for talking about places or events as if you were just there. An odd thing to do, considering the shop was only a couple of miles away from his house. Eventually, a truck pulls to the side of the road. It was a baby blue pickup truck, to be exact. Apparently, there were two men in the truck, probably both in their late 40s or so, pretty average looking. He said the driver was a bit burly and sort of looked like Jackie Gleason. The truck was only a 3-seater, so the man in the passenger side had to move to the middle. No words were spoken, apart from the driver asking him where he was going. This didn't strike my father as odd, so he proceeded to sit in silence, not suspecting anything. When out of nowhere, one of the guys randomly bursts into laughter. According to my father, this wasn't your ordinary laugh, but something much more diabolical. Surely enough, the driver looks at my father with what he claimed were the devil's eyes, now chiming in with the laughter. As you could expect, they start to go in a different route. My dad knew they weren't going anywhere near the desired destination. He was trying to play it cool, wait for his chance, and luckily, a couple of minutes later, they finally hit a red light. The driver slowly crept his arm across the cab and began caressing my dad's neck. I guess his fight or flight kicked in, and with a surge of adrenaline, he unlocked the door and bolts out, not looking back. He said he hid in a local church and waited as they drove around looking for him. Some years later, my dad was watching the news when the mugshot of a man popped up on screen. His heart sank. The man was undoubtedly the same one who had picked him up hitchhiking. That man was notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy. When my daughter was about a year old, we moved into a 2-story townhouse, kitchen and living room downstairs, bedrooms upstairs. One day, when I was walking from the living room to the kitchen, I saw what looked like a large black cloud in the middle of the room that quickly disappeared into the ceiling. I brushed it off as my eyes adjusting to the light in the room, and forgot about it. But shortly thereafter, I started noticing my daughter would sit in the middle of the kitchen and babble away like she was talking to someone. And almost every night, she would wake up at 2 a.m. and start chattering away. After watching something on TV, I decided that maybe it wasn't just a lot of random events, and maybe there was something there. One day, I stood in my bedroom, introduced myself, and said that if there was someone there who wanted to communicate with me, I would listen. The next day I woke up to a tapping in the room. It took a few minutes to find the source. The corner of a poster hanging on the wall was being pulled out a few inches and then let go, so that it would hit the wall. No AC on, no open windows. I laid there and watched for a few minutes, then decided I was too chicken to respond and ran out of the room. A few nights later, I woke up with the feeling of someone being in the room with us. The room was pitch black, which is unusual since we had a nightlight in the bathroom in case we had to get up with the baby. I looked at my clock to see if the power had gone off, but it was still working. Once my eyes adjusted a little more, I could see a moving mass in the doorway, like a black cloud but moving. I put the covers over my head and pretended it wasn't there, but didn't wake up my husband, who didn't know anything about the other experiences either. Later that week, my daughter wakes up at 2 a.m, chatter time, but this time she is screaming. One night I fell asleep on the couch downstairs and woke up to my husband thundering down the stairs. He tells me he woke up feeling like something was watching him and saw a mass of black smoke in the doorway. He ran through it on his way out of the room and said it felt like electricity. A few minutes later, the baby started screaming. This continued for weeks. The screaming every night, feeling like someone was watching us, seeing black blurs out of the corner of our eyes. In November, I found out my grandmother was dying. The day that I received the call was the last sleepless night we had. It was almost like it took pity on us and left us alone. This isn't the only experience I've had, but they always seem to center around my daughter. She's 14 now, and I have encouraged her to retain her ability to talk to and see things that most people cannot. This happened very recently. So we've been only living here for a few months, and my window is the only window out of the entire house that has a view of the backyard, and it's also right next to our very squeaky back door, meaning I always hear when someone comes in and out. So my family went out to run errands last night, leaving me home alone trying to catch up on my classes, because college life. Well, it was going good for the first hour, until I hear the back gate open and shut, and at first I thought, oh, they must be back, thinking of my family, but that thought was immediately gone when I remembered we have a front door, and there's no reason for them to come in through the back. So I sit as still as I possibly can and listen. I start to hear the sound of crunching leaves, like someone is stepping on them, but I can also hear they are trying to move slowly. At this point, they are right under my window, and I know this because we have a couch located right underneath it, and I hear someone actually sit on it and let out a grunt, which also lets me find out it's a man who's doing this, and I'm feeling extremely grateful over my paranoia of having my blinds open. It's at this point that I'm completely freaking out, not being able to move at all because there is literally someone sitting under my window, and I sit there motionless for 2 minutes until I start hearing a tapping on the window. They started out light. With each set of taps he added more weight to them, and I can feel my eyes grow even wider, and immediately feel like I'm going to pass out, but I still can't move. It's like I'm paralyzed with fear, and it still keeps on going, the constant tapping, until I finally snap out of it, and immediately, without shoes, and I'm just in shorts and a tank top, do I jump up, grab my keys and run out the front door into 30-degree weather at night, which in my defense was definitely not the smartest thing to do, as who knows if he was alone. Someone could have easily just been at the front door the moment I got out, but I didn't care, and I didn't even feel cold. I just needed to leave. I hopped into my car and drove off, and parked at a Walmart nearby and sat there in shock, not even believing that had actually happened. I finally picked up my phone and see my hands are shaking visibly, but I managed to call my parents, and as soon as I heard my dad's voice I burst into tears. I wasn't even able to tell him anything, and it wasn't until about 5 minutes later that they show up in the parking lot, and I calmed down enough to tell them what happened. Then we went back home. I was terrified to go back, and even waited in the car until my dad came back from the backyard after inspecting it, and said that whoever there was gone. We also debated about calling the police, but I honestly don't think anything would have been done. Just file a report since I didn't even see his face, and he was probably long gone by now. But I'm really regretting it, because I'm still terrified and don't even feel safe in my own home. I've been trying to distract myself all day now, but I'm so shaken up, I'm just hoping I can forget about this whole ordeal. This happened around a year ago. It was a Saturday night, and I was doing lists for friends that had been out to the club near where I lived. Obviously I couldn't drink as I wasn't old enough, so this would be my usual Saturday. It passed the time, and it helped me make a bit of pocket money. I was in a parking spot opposite the club waiting for one of my friends to come out, so that I could take her home. I was just scrolling through Snapchat waiting for her to finally turn up, when I heard the passenger side door open and someone get in. Expecting it to be my friend, I looked up and said, "Hey!" But to my surprise, it wasn't her. It was a random guy I hadn't seen before, and he said, "I know you don't know me, but could you give me a ride home? I really need to get out of here." He sounded really panicked. I told him no, that I don't give rides to strangers, and I was meant to be picking up a friend. He sighed, got out the car, and walked extremely fast down the street away from me. I thought it was weird, but assumed it was just some drunk guy who tried to avoid having to walk home, until the next day. I was going down on Facebook when I saw a photo of the same guy posted by the police in my town. Apparently he had shot someone behind the club, and they were looking for him. That's when I realized he was trying to use me as a getaway. It scares me to think about the fact he was in my car with a gun, and had I given him a ride, anything could have happened. A few important things before I tell my story. Number 1, my kitchen has a big window next to a door. At the right side through the window, you can look at our backyard. It doesn't have a curtain. I always sit at our dinner table to work on school things, and stuff which is placed in front of a large window. 2, we have 2 Shih Tzu/Maltese mix dogs. They're very sweet, but they bark a lot when they hear something outside. 3, when this happened, I was home alone with my little brother of 13. And 4, my neighbors have a cat that walks around our house a lot. With that said, this is the story. A few months ago, my parents decided to go on a little holiday together for 2 days. My brother and I were fine with being home alone, and we didn't really want our grandparents to babysit us. My parents agreed, and they left that Saturday morning. The whole day was just normal. Everything went like it usually does. When it was about 11:30 p.m, my brother and I went upstairs to sleep. I put out the lights and locked the windows and doors, and everything seemed normal. Around 2 a.m, I woke up to the sound of my dogs barking loudly. They do this pretty often because of the neighbor's cat walking around our house. I thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. Usually though, the dogs will cease their barking after 5 minutes, but they did not. I thought this was really weird, so I got out of bed and checked on my brother. He was still asleep. I chose not to wake him up and walked downstairs alone. I went down. My dogs were barking towards the large kitchen window, which wasn't that weird since the cats walked in our garden a lot too. I put a light on and walked around the kitchen to see if something was off. Everything seemed fine. I then checked if maybe my dogs were in pain or something, and they weren't. I then looked outside to see if the cat was walking around, but it was nowhere to be seen. This made me feel very uneasy. After this, I didn't feel like sleeping anymore, so I sat down at the dinner table to watch some YouTube and chill out for a bit. After about 10 minutes, I started to feel uneasy again. I had this weird feeling of being watched from the window. I thought it would be better to shut the lights off and go back upstairs because I wasn't feeling safe. I grabbed a kitchen knife to protect myself if anything were about to happen. When I got upstairs, I checked on my brother again. He was still sleeping, and I sat in our hallway so I could hear things downstairs better. After a while, my dogs began barking again. At this point I was so scared that I was nearly in tears. I knew I had to call the police and then walk downstairs. The police told me they would be there in 15 minutes. I went downstairs as silently as I could. When I reached our hallway downstairs, I noticed that the lights by our front door were on. This only happens when people walk by, as they're sensor lights. But I stupidly shrugged it off as being our neighbor's cat. When I got back into the kitchen, my dogs were still barking. I turned on the lights and sat down. And not a minute later did I notice movement behind the large window in our garden. I just froze. I couldn't move. My dogs started barking like crazy because they could see the movement too. A pretty large person was moving slowly towards the door. I still had the knife, but I was 15 and petite. The person looked a lot larger than me, and I surely couldn't win against him. He had to have seen me, because he started moving faster towards the door. Fortunately, at this point the police arrived. They knocked at the front door. I sprinted towards the door to let them in, and the man probably ran away, because when the police investigated the backyard, he was gone. Later, with the help of a police dog, the man was arrested and charged for attempted burglary. He apparently was arrested a few years ago because of attempted assault. My brother and I didn't get hurt, and everything turned out fine, but I'm still too scared to stay home alone. To the crazy man who tried to break into our house, let's not meet. This happened when I was around 12 years old. I attended school in the neighboring town, which is located some 7 kilometers away from my home village. This one day I missed the bus and had to walk home instead. It's an hour-long trip where you walk on the side of the road in the middle of the wheat fields. As soon as I left, the town and the last of the houses was behind me. A car pulled next to me. Looking back, it might have been following me for quite a while. I was too preoccupied with imagining clone troopers fighting in the field to notice. I thought it was probably someone asking for directions, so I walked over to the rolled-down window. There was a woman in her 30s who told me she knew my mum, and if I didn't want to catch a ride home. I didn't recognize her, but my mum has a lot of friends, but I didn't want to be rude or hurt her feelings, and rolled with her story, pretending I knew her. Of course I'd like a ride home, and hopped in and was sitting next to her. All was normal. We chatted and I was glad I would be home early. So we hit the road and she asked which school I went to. I told her I go to this school and that I have great friends and that I have good marks. But she interrupted me and asked about the new CCTV cameras. Now I may have been a slow kid, but this really flashed a big red light for me. I said, yeah, we had new CCTV cameras installed, as earlier that year a crazy woman entered one school in my country and stabbed a student, so the state funded countermeasures like buzzers on doors and stuff. I started to sink into the seat. I was not comfortable. I don't know this woman, and she's asking weirdly specific questions about the school surveillance. I remember the cold that ran through my whole body. What the heck am I supposed to do? I seriously thought about jumping out of the car and taking my chances with the asphalt rather than getting taken. She must have noticed, because she started stroking my leg to calm me down, saying things like, "Why are you so nervous? You know what? I'll buy you an ice cream. Wouldn't you like that? Wouldn't you? I have some at home. We don't even have to stop at a shop." Ha, no, screw that, I thought. We entered my village, and as soon as we passed the first farm, I pleaded to her to stop, that my uncle lives there and I have to visit him before going home. She didn't want to at first, but I started making a scene and was preparing to open the door and jump out if she didn't stop right there. She reluctantly pulled over, and I got out as fast as I could, muttered a hasty thank you, and ran towards some people picking up apples in their garden. I walked over, made an excuse to talk to them, and waited until the car went away. She stuck there for no more than 5 minutes, but it felt like way longer. I made a total fool out of myself in front of the young couple in the garden, as I had no idea what to say, but I just didn't want to be alone. I waited and waited until she finally left, and I stuck around for a few more minutes, playing with the couple's dog, and then went home, shaken by the whole incident. I never told my mum, but I still don't know if she wasn't one of her friends, and I didn't want to tell her how weirdly I acted in front of her, if that was the case. I also was afraid that maybe she wouldn't believe me, or be angry for getting into a car with a stranger. So I told her that a friend's mum took me home, after I didn't make the bus, and never mentioned it again. I don't know who the woman was. Maybe she really was a friend of my mother's and I was just overreacting. But I sincerely hope never to meet her again, as she gave me the creeps. When we were younger, about 13 or so, me and 3 friends were just goofing off after school as usual, riding our bikes and just doing what young teens do. We eventually rode past the old abandoned house that's local for us, which has basically been there since we can remember. My friend's parents, who were here since the 70s, can remember that house being abandoned since there also. Anyhow, we rode past it as usual, and decided to go a bit closer because we always were curious. As we approached it, we saw someone peeking through the curtains. As curious teenagers, we naturally go to inspect. As we got closer, the curtains kind of drew back and the figure disappeared. Stumped, we decided to approach the veranda, and that's when we heard a baby crying. The crying slowly progressed into wailing, and eventually one friend had enough and knocked to see if anyone was home. After 5 minutes of continued knocking and wailing, the door finally opened. It was a little lady who looked to be about 40 or so. My friend asked if everything was okay and if the baby was fine, and the lady simply told us to go away. My friend continued to ask if she needed help or if everything was alright, and she continued with her reply of, "Go away." This continued for about a minute until she shut the door on us, and the wailing became louder still. At this point, everyone wanted to run, but my friend decided to knock again in fear the child was being neglected. Eventually, after a few knocks, the door just kind of opened. Not scary creaking open, but rather it was left unlocked. We, as dumb teenagers, walked in to see if everything was okay, and partially due to curiosity. As all four of us walked in, the crying stopped, and we stood in this abandoned house covered in dust, and everything was like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. We took a few steps forward and the crying began again. By this point, we decided we needed to find the child, so me and a friend went upstairs while the other two investigated downstairs. As we climbed the stairs, the crying got louder and louder, and we continued to search each room slowly. Eventually, we reached the last room, and it was apparently where the cot was, so we opened the door to investigate. The first thing we both noticed was nothing except for a baby carriage in the far left corner near the window. The crying was coming from there. It was as clear as day. We made our way to it, peeked over to find nothing. But the crying was still there. From this empty carriage. My head started spinning. I don't know what to feel. I called out for my friends downstairs, and they ran upstairs and saw, or rather, didn't see, what we couldn't see. They filled us in onto what they saw downstairs, which was the woman walking into the kitchen downstairs. They followed her, and she vanished. We all knew this whole situation was messy, and we ran as quickly as we could to the front door. We got onto our bikes, looked back, to see the door being closed slowly by someone and then locked. A few moments later, the curtains were pulled back by a woman holding a child, smiling. We rode hard and fast back home and didn't turn back, and didn't sleep much for a few days. A few years after, the house got demolished, but people began seeing a woman holding a baby at the local parks and bridge. That is, when you didn't see the kid who drowned in the sewers nearby. I hated that area, and I was so glad when I moved. Sometimes I drive past it at night, and I just get the worst feeling ever. It's always too quiet, and still scares me 11 years later. I live in the suburban part of a small rural town in eastern Missouri, in a pretty quiet neighborhood. We've had one crime here in the past 3 years, and it was me who committed it. I'm a jaywalker, comprised mostly of elderly women and single mothers. We own 4 vehicles. My car, my mum's van, my stepdad's car, and my mum's old truck that's illegal to drive. I was home alone about a week after graduation, while my stepdad was at work. My mum was taking my youngest brother to the doctor's office, and my 2 middle brothers were at their friend's house, so I was lounging on the couch in my fuzzy robe and underwear playing Fallout. My stepdad is a professional chef, and he does 80% of the cooking at home. I have terrible anxiety, and an addiction to investigation discovery. So whenever I come home alone, I keep his longest, sharpest knife either on my person or within arm's reach at all times. It may have saved my life or something. A knock on the door isn't too suspicious. We frequently get solicitors and Mormons in the neighborhood, so I wasn't too worried. Being a cautious person, I peeked out through the curtains just a bit to see who it was. I'd seen the guy around the neighborhood before, walking, and I didn't feel threatened by him, since if it got physical, I at least had 5 inches on him, and a knife. I went to open the door, figuring that at worst I could politely turn him away, tell him I wasn't interested and go on with my life. At best, well, he was cute in a generic way. So I opened the door, resting my hand on the back of the couch, where I've hidden the knife under a blanket, just in case. As soon as I open the door, I know something's off. I've got a blunted effect due to a combination of depression, PTSD from abuse, and a schizotypical personality disorder. So I've grown used to faking facial expressions to fit in. I thought maybe this dude had similar issues, because his face was not normal. He had a big friendly smile right below a pair of absolutely dead eyes. "Hey, beautiful day out. Mind if I come in for a moment?" I kinda smiled back at him. No, Mum doesn't like me letting strangers in." "Oh." His smile got bigger. "Okay. How are you doing?" At this point, I was starting to feel nervous. I shrugged. "Can't complain, I guess. Are you here to sell me something or tell me about God?" He shrugged back. "Oh, you know. Can I come in? Maybe talk to your mum?" I'll go get her. She's in the backyard." I moved to close the door and step back, not turning my back to the dude. Before I closed the door, he reached out and stopped the door. His fake smile was gone. His face was dead. "You're home alone. Your mum isn't in the backyard." I paused and swallowed hard. Then I pushed the door open again. "What do you want, man?" "To come inside. Please let me in." I reached over, quickly slid the knife out from under the blanket, and pointed it at him. "I'm not letting you in. Please, just leave." He looked at the knife, back up at me, and blinked rapidly. Then he affixed the smile to his face. "Oh, no problem. Bye." I watched him turn around and walk back down the street, until he turned the corner. Then I locked and bolted every door and window in the house, got the dog out of my mum's bedroom, and resumed my gaming. I then called my aunt's boyfriend, the only cop I trust, let him know what happened, and stayed on the phone with him until my mum got home from the doctor's office. She called around town, and found out a couple of other people had seen him walking and driving around, but no one knew who he was, and we were all on high alert for about a week. It's been about a month now, and no one in town has seen him since. He's just disappeared. This happened a few years ago, when I was about 19 or 20. It was night. One of my best girlfriends was out celebrating her birthday, and a couple of other girls. I'd had a cold for a week or so, and I explained that I didn't feel that well. They asked if I was comfortable going home by myself, and that the trip should be about an hour of public transport, and therefore I tell them it should be fine. The train trip is fine as always, and I had to wait about 10 minutes, but I have my phone and earphones and decide to listen to some music. The train arrives at my station. I live about half an hour away from the capital of Denmark, and here the buses only leaves once an hour that night. And I just missed mine. This sucks, as I write to my dad, not expecting an answer as he's definitely asleep. My phone only has 3%, so I put it on flight mode and decide to walk home. It takes 45 minutes. I start walking. There's no people around me, but it's safe. It's my hometown where I've grown up, and where I've been living my entire life. Not long after, a car stops. It's a man, and he asks if I'd need a ride. I must admit I was hesitant, but so tired. Plus, I remember noticing a child seat in the back of the car, which was a detail that brought me comfort, as he's a father. I thanked him a few times, and he asked me what I had been doing. I tell him, and ask him back. He explains that he had been at a friend's house playing board games, and he asks where I was heading. We listen to some music, and generally everything is awesome. I think of my quick judgment, and I even remember thinking, this is something I'll remember forever. I can go hitchhiking. I can trust strangers. Generally, I'm the kind of person that prefers to believe in the good side of people, good intentions, and I really felt bad for not believing this guy. I had been staring out the front of the car for a few minutes, but suddenly out of the corner of my eye, I noticed some weird movement. I guess it's not that hard to imagine what he's doing. I've previously explained that I'm at the university, and he asks if I want to earn some extra money. Flabbergasted, I tell him no. I'm very polite in the way I'm answering him. I didn't know what he would do. He keeps going again and again and again, and grabs my hand to try to pull me towards him. I plead with him, telling I don't want to do that. The car stops at a red light, and I'm so glad that it did. I open the door and jump out and ran to the sidewalk. "Have a good night," he yells, and I, for some messed up reason, reply, "You too." The light turns green, but the car still sits there. He yells out my name and waves, and I felt like screaming. Why did I tell him my name? And that exact detail terrifies me. I shakingly lock up my phone, turn off the flight mode, and see that my father replied and asked if he should come pick me up. I immediately call him and cry. I've never shared anything like this before, and after hearing a few stories, I felt like I should have shared it. I want to still believe that everyone is generally good, that the world is kind in which we live. But after this, be careful out there and take care of yourself. Let me set the scene. I live in the outskirts of a town at the end of a terraced house, and there are lots of houses in my area, in front and behind. I was home alone with 3 dogs. My boyfriend was over at his friend's, which was a 3-minute walk away. And this time, we didn't really lock the front door if one of us was in the house, but now I do. Nothing really happened where we lived. We had 3 decently sized dogs, and were a bit naive. And to be fair, I had recently moved in here with my boyfriend, and before I lived in a small village where everyone knew everyone and you could actually leave your door unlocked. So I was sat in my pajamas watching TV, with all the dogs next to me when the door knocks. It was around 10 PM, and I was in my PJs, so was a bit annoyed. I got the dogs off me, and walk out of my living room and pulled the living room door closed, closing the dogs in. Bear in mind it took all of 10 seconds to do this, and as I approach, the door swings open, and this man that I have never seen storms into my house and gets right into my face. There's also another man and a woman right behind him who don't enter. I was frozen in shock. Who the hell do you think you are? You think you can just run around here doing what you want? What? Don't give me that. Do you think I'm a muppet? I saw you and all your little friends running back into this house. I'm literally standing here in my PJs and haven't been outside. Okay. Do you think I was born yesterday? Well, you just walked into someone's house that you've never met and screamed at her, so maybe it wasn't her, man. Maybe. At this point, my dog started barking behind the door. The man stares at me for what seems like forever, but was more probable just a few seconds, and then walks out and slams the door shut. I was standing there shaking for a few seconds before I started to just get mad, when I realized what had happened. I lock the door and ring my boyfriend straight away, who gets home in about 1 minute flat, but the group was nowhere to be seen. I didn't want to call the police, because I couldn't really give my boyfriend a good description when he was asking. In the 7 years since, I have not bumped into these people again. Thank God. I now always lock the door, and thankfully, as we've had 2 other occasions where people have come late at night, but those are other stories. However, if it did happen again, I would like to think I would handle myself better now. This story was told by my grandma, as unfortunately, my grandpa passed before I was born. My family comes from rural Texas. My grandfather worked for a farmer and had to check oil wells at the end of the day. He was in town getting some groceries and beer before heading out to do his checks, then go home. Before getting to his first stop, my grandpa sees a hitchhiker. Being the 70s, he pulls over and offers the man a ride. They make small talk, as they get to the first well. When my grandpa gets back into the truck, he is surprised with a knife to the throat. The hitchhiker tells him to drive or die. Being a quick thinker, my grandpa offers the hitchhiker a beer, knowing that soon enough the guy will have to pee. Sure enough, after a while, nature was calling. The hitchhiker orders grandpa to pull over so that he can pee. As the guy reaches to unbuckle his pants, grandpa pulls out a pistol from under his seat and points at the guy's head. Long story short, grandpa makes the guy check the welds for him. After the last stop, he has the guy stripped naked, takes his clothes, and leaves him naked in the country. When I was 17, I saw the scariest thing in my life. My parents went out of town for the weekend, which wasn't a big deal for me as they did that all the time. Well, I was home alone one Friday night at around 9 or 10 o'clock and was starting to get a mild headache. My dad always kept the ibuprofen on his nightstand next to his bed, so I went to get some. When I turned on the light to the bedroom, I saw a black figure about 3 feet in height and 4 feet in front of me. I know this sounds cheesy, but it had horns on its head kind of like Batman, and long skinny feet. It moved so fluidly, like a mixture of smoke and water. I watched it run from in front of me around the bed and into the wall. The wall was the one wall I shared with my bedroom. I had other experiences in that apartment, but that one was by far the creepiest. This took place when I was 12. I live in a suburban neighborhood. Our house is beside railway tracks. Because of this, teenagers will walk along the tracks at night and climb over the railings into our backyard. Most of the time they're only playing around or exploring, so there isn't much trouble with them. But sometimes more malicious people will come off the tracks. I was home alone when this took place. It was around 1:20, and it was very dark outside. I was watching TV in my room, and I heard my house phone ring, but I let it go to voicemail because I wasn't bothered to answer it. 2 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time I went to answer it in case it was urgent, despite the fact it was 1 a.m. When I picked up the phone, I said hello, and received no reply. I said hello again, but got no answer, so I hung up. It was probably a butt dial. When I went back, I settled into my room watching TV, and I heard a rattling sound from outside. I heard it again, so I looked out my window thinking it was probably just teenagers trying to jump over the chain link fence. Except there wasn't a group of teenagers. It was just a guy trying to get over the fence. He had a torch in his mouth, and I knew this was shady, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't call the police. I just watched him. I don't know what I was thinking. The man finally got over the fence. I couldn't see his face, but he was pointing his flashlight at various things in my yard. Everything valuable, such as bikes, were kept away in a locked shed, so I knew he would just get bored and walk away. But he didn't. He hung around in the garden for a few minutes and then went towards my kitchen door. From my bedroom, I could hear the handle on the back door being messed around with. My heart sunk as I remembered that I'd left my phone in the kitchen when I was getting food earlier that night, and the only other phone was the house phone that was downstairs in the hallway, so I couldn't call the police. I then heard him bang his fist on the door, but after a minute, he stopped. I looked out of my bedroom window and watched him jump back over the fence and switch off his flashlight. I watched my yard for a few minutes to make sure he was gone. Since then, I make sure I have my phone with me everywhere I go. I hate to think what would have happened had he got in. This is a story that my dad told me not too long ago about my grandpa and how he came extremely close to being murdered. My grandpa used to be a pastor at a local church, and one night when he was driving home from a service and was wearing his robes and collar, he saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road and decided to pull over and pick him up, like he usually would when he saw a hitchhiker. He pulled over and the man got in. The man was wearing overalls and was also carrying an old metal lunchbox with him. My grandpa assumed he was a construction worker who did not have a ride home after a shift. My grandpa and him started to converse and eventually arrived at the man's destination. The man got out and thanked my grandpa for the ride. A few days later, my grandpa was talking to his neighbor. At one point in the conversation, she brought up a story she had seen on the news about a man who would get rides from people by hitchhiking. Then he would reach his destination, would take out a knife out of his old metal lunchbox, and finish the life of the person driving. My grandpa almost fainted after hearing this news. He assumed the only reason he was alive, and talking to her, was because of the robes and collar he was wearing.